Okay, so I've self-identified as a monarchist for the better part of the past 2 years. Before then, I was your fairly standard conservative who just never really dove into political philosophy. But anarchy and communism seem to be the extremes of political philosophy in the sense that they're both conclusive ends to the clear problem of government. One extreme thinks the state has problems simply because it isn't large enough, and so people need to give all power over to some omniscient state. The other extreme thinks that the state has problems because an illegitimate power structure where those within it have undue authority over the populace is inherently going to hinder the growth of humanity. While I am clearly only leaning towards one of these extremes, it's important to note that the gap between classical monarchy and libertarianism is far smaller than the gap between classical monarchy and anarchy. Let me explain. Monarchy and libertarianism both function under a set morality where private property rights and free markets are allowed to flourish. Your standard libertarian is fairly okay with a government even slightly larger than monarchy. And the theory gets more messy and less conclusive or concretized the farther away that you get from either extreme. But classical monarchy is an extreme when you keep morality dictated by the state. And I say classical because I'll propose my own neo-monarchy towards the end. Now, the people that I've heard talk about anarchy tend to praise the non-aggression principle and private property rights, and I'm fully aware that anarchy means no rulers, not no rules. But my question right there would be, how do you enforce any morality whatsoever without aggression? And I also get the principle of primary aggression, where one aggression is just retaliatory, and there would be organizations, sometimes called dispute resolution organizations, that would arise to settle these disputes so that the morality enforced by the DROs would be subject to different prices, different levels of public acceptance, and they themselves would be subject to the retaliation from other DROs. But it's still enforcing morality on someone who might not accept that morality. A good example of what I'm talking about is private property rights. If someone comes and stands on your land, are they aggressing against you? Well, in a world of private property rights, they're aggressing against your property by standing on it because they might not be damaging it, but they're putting you, the owner, in a position where if they got injured on your land, they could surely find a DRO that would want to go after the landowner because it's the same situation that we're in now where someone trespassing that gets injured can sue the landowner under the right scenario. Doesn't make it right, but in an anarchist world, who's dictating right from wrong for each individual other than the individual themselves? And then the landowner would have to find a DRO that supports their morality, and you'd end up with two DROs just vying for justice, even though in an anarchist world, you have to define justice because it could either be the justice against the landowner for having land that someone else can hurt themselves on, or it's the justice against the trespasser for violating private property rights. But in an anarchist world, there are no rights. It's all subject to the individual's discretion. And yes, there's the general consensus of what the morality is as dictated by the public. But I guess the point I'm really trying to put forward is Rothbard's idea of the individual veto. And I'm not positive he developed that idea, but it's from Rothbard that I first heard about it. It was specifically in his criticism of John C. Calhoun's disquisition on government, because Calhoun had talked about how the states were a check on the federal government and vice versa. But as Rothbard correctly points out, that's still an aggregation of power to the government and thus prone to aggression against an individual in favor of the community. So whenever there's a morality dictated around a certain mass of land or by a certain landowner, who's to say that everyone identifies the land ownership in the same way? And the idea that I had to solve this is to hold people to their own standards. So if someone trespasses on someone else's land, they've now shown that by their own standards, there are no private land rights. If someone steals from someone else, they've now shown stealing is okay in their world, and therefore they can be stolen from because the morality would be dictated by that which is initially perceived as aggression. And the perception of aggression comes solely from the person who perceives themselves as a victim. And I understand this sounds problematic on the surface, but let me explain it more, and then I'll debunk my own idea here and then debunk that. So let's say a radical leftist thinks that you're aggressing against them by not paying for their birth control. They can only retaliate by not paying for your birth control, which you likely wouldn't expect them to anyways. However, if they show up at your house and they start destroying your property, they've now surrendered their own private property rights to an equal or lesser degree, meaning you can seize up to or less than they took or destroyed from you. And in the vast majority of cases, this would not tend towards the absolute of war, but rather the absolute of peace, because people would just not want to be aggressed upon. And this is where DROs can be helpful, because they can signal to the community, assuming that the community trusts a specific DRO, that there was some inequality of aggression which must be corrected. The big problem that I see with this is that you can't tell everything about the morality of someone from one action. If someone broke into your house, how do you know their morality is breaking into houses is okay, instead of breaking into every house except for my own is okay? But I'll debunk my debunking here, because you can only take so much from someone's actions, and you can assume that if they act in a certain way, the action alone is what's warranted. So then, who's interpreting the action? Because someone could key your car but claim that your car just got in the way of them walking with their key. So they might say that all you can do as a retaliation is walk somewhere with a key sticking out. It sounds insane, but if there are no rulers to enforce rules, I'd expect this kind of explanation from someone. The obvious rebuttal to that is that a car that someone owns appears to have a scratch from the actions of someone else, whether it was intentional or not. And intention might play into the punishment in today's legal system, but if you accidentally crash into someone or kill someone, that's still something you have to take responsibility for. So you could also consider the absolute effect of actions. This would specifically be the action that the individual is responsible for, and then the direct effects of those actions. So if someone tried saying, well, I broke into your house because my morality says everyone can break into everyone's house except for my own, the rebuttal could be, so I'll adopt the same mindset. Everyone can break into everyone's house except for my own. And then the initial aggressor and the homeowner are at odds. And then the DROs come into this yet again. I should also be clear that I'm just trying to think these ideas through. So I think that a morality arising as the accepted public morality is possible for sure. But I think praising the non-aggression principle and private property rights is too superficial to actually deal with the philosophy behind true anarchy. So I'll give it some more thought and make a follow-up video to this for sure, but as a final point here, I just want to mention Minarchy and why I see philosophical backing for it, and then I'll cover my own idea for Minarchy. So, Minarchists wanting government to only control military, police, and courts is not random. They want control of the military because they protect individuals' rights from foreign threats. A unified military is also far stronger than independent militias acting on their own accord with no central commander. The police protect an individual's rights against other domestic threats. So it's believed that without homogeneous conduct rules for police, there would be far more vigilante groups carrying out what they see as justice. So it would quite literally devolve into mob rule against various individuals. And then the court system is to hand down verdicts of justice based on the accepted morality and the objective facts at hand. The idea behind public courts is that to privatize them would be to open them to more corruption. And while I've heard people try to explain why the military could be just as strong and unified without a government, and the vigilante groups wouldn't devolve into mob rule, and the court system wouldn't be corrupt, all of the ideas that I've heard deal with someone's own thoughts about how things could progress. And while it's important to deal with the tangibles at hand, the big problem that I have with monarchy in its current state is that military, police, and courts are funded through taxation, which gives the government the ability to control currency and the ability to pull from a bottomless pit to fund whatever it is that they want, whether it's devaluing of the collective wealth through inflation, or pointless wars, or even public works projects that someone paying for might never use. So now I'll end this video with a thought and a question to ponder. My ideal system at the time of making this video is monarchy with no taxation, which I called neo-monarchy earlier. I guess there wouldn't really be a government body, but rather just the separate military, police, and courts, because private property rights and the non-aggression principle are favorable morals for a society to function on. So if one of those branches doesn't have enough funding, but they hypothetically provide a service that people need, there's a reason they aren't getting the funding, and I guess they have to scale back and figure out what they did wrong. Maybe people want them to be fully transparent with all of their spending before people will just voluntarily contribute. And if they have too much funding, they're still constrained because the second that they use the money to abuse an individual or they mismanage the voluntary contributions, the free media would report it and funding for that branch would drop. So it's a way of keeping them accountable directly. And the issue of a consistent currency is so arbitrary that I'll just say it'll work itself out. I mean, throughout history, commodity currency has developed into specie currency, which would become the standard. So precious metals would become currency, and then there would be trusted banks that arise. And really, currency is something that I can make an entire video on just on its own. And with taxless monarchy, you also wouldn't have anyone capable of imposing their own monopolies because they can't stop someone from developing their own military, police, or courts. But this form of voluntarily funded military, police, and courts, where their existence is completely beholden to the people and they must practice the generally accepted morality, seems like a favorable form of monarchy. But I guess that my question would be, is taxless monarchy the ultimate end of anarchy anyways? Because I feel like they're one and the same. Let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are on this. Leave a like and subscribe as well. I have a great video coming out tomorrow on this channel talking with a research analyst about the philosophy behind the deep state. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.